Hello and welcome to the first video for this week looking at exploring substance use on language learning and wellbeing. This video is going to focus specifically on alcohol consumption as a particular form of substance use. There are all sorts of substances that we're going to explore in this module, and you'll perhaps have seen from the tasks already today that we are thinking about substance use in a very wide variety of contexts, including substances that are both legal and illegal, that have different effects on people, that there are different perceptions about who takes or uses them, and different contexts in which they might do so. We're also thinking about concepts like acceptability, which doesn't always intersect with whether or not something is legal for it to be considered acceptable. Marijuana is a very good example of this, where it is illegal in this country, but many people are very open about their smoking of marijuana and do not see it as a problem. So lots of very interesting things that we could start to think about here, about the intersecting factors as to how different substances are perceived, how they're talked about, what kind of language is used when they're referred to. And we're going to look at drinking alcohol specifically in this video, because it offers a really interesting case study of something which is legal, which is not only legal, but which is in many contexts ingrained in British culture for many people, though of course not all, and therefore is something that manifests in lots and lots of different contexts and in lots of different conversations. So there is a coexistence between, on the one hand, widespread acceptance of alcohol consumption as something which is normalised for many people, something which is used as something to mark celebrations or sadness, as viewed as something which is an entirely acceptable way to alleviate stress, for example, when consumed in moderation, that is consumed by people of a very wide variety of ages, though of course there are legal restrictions around it, which makes it very interesting from that perspective as well. So it is not illegal for most people to drink alcohol, but if you are under the age of 18, in most contexts it is. So there's an interesting dimension to it there. But also it's something which is particularly interesting because we know that there are lots of, there is a very wide spectrum of the different relationships that people perceive that others have with alcohol, and that ranges from something which is viewed as highly normalised and very socially acceptable, right over to something which is considered as a serious medical problem, and something which is a term we're going to come across today, pathologised, as something which is a medical issue which can be fatal. So the main study that we're going to focus on today is the Thurnall Reid article, which is one of the options that you've been given for your reading this week. Though if you haven't chosen to read that article and you've chosen to read the other, that's absolutely fine, don't worry about that. But what is quite interesting is where Thurnall Reid and indeed other research starts with this, about thinking about what constitutes our sense of what sensible drinking means. Now, of course, there are government guidelines that exist around what the medical profession feels is a sensible amount of units. That's how it tends to be counted for people to consume per week. But the research suggests that actually it's very rare that those units or any similar sort of guidelines are actually invoked when people think and talk about what they consider sensible drinking. And Thurnall Reid in particular argues very persuasively that actually our concepts of what he calls civilised, which we might also think of as sensible, and uncivilised drinking are products of a wide range of intersecting factors which often have very little to do with how much alcohol people are actually consuming, and have much more consideration of other things. So let's think about those in a bit more detail. So in particular, Thurnall Reid highlights that considerations about when someone is drinking, where they're drinking, what they're drinking, with who, and perceived reasons as to why they're drinking are things that are much more relevant for most people when they construct and consider whether or not engaging in alcohol consumption is something that can be considered either civilised or sensible. And we'll see lots of examples where this is reflected in the language that is used to refer to both the alcohol consumption and the person who is doing it. So for example, Drinking in the evening is for some reason considered much more socially acceptable, more civilised, more sensible than drinking during the day. We might think about the reasons for that. Similarly, drinking on a weekend or on a Friday night is typically considered more sensible, more civilised, more socially acceptable than drinking on a weekday. Though these things are, of course, do vary from person to person. Where somebody is drinking is a very interesting one to consider. It's considered very socially acceptable to drink in a pub. Until fairly recently, it was considered relatively not socially acceptable to drink in a park, though for younger people who are not legally allowed to drink, there is a degree of variation in this. But in the current context in which we find ourselves, suddenly drinking in parks has become, whilst pubs have been closed, become very normalised and considered a very socially acceptable and indeed a positive activity for many people. So there's lots of sort of contextual factors that we could think about as well. Similarly, what somebody drinks, and I'm not suggesting that these factors are unrelated, but what somebody is drinking is also often a relevant factor. So if somebody is drinking a pint of beer, that tends to be viewed as something which is perhaps more civilised, more socially acceptable, often something which can be gendered. So prototypically we might expect that men drink beer and women drink wine, and there can be different assessments about how sensible or civilised that is if we have people drinking things that are perhaps unexpected. There's also questions about volume, of course. So if somebody is drinking a bottle of wine an evening, that's probably less likely to raise an eyebrow than somebody drinking half a bottle of vodka, even though potentially those alcohol units might be the same. It's interesting to think about which ones we problematise, which ones we perceive as being acceptable, and what we perceive to be a problem. With who is another interesting consideration. So very prototypically, it's considered less civilised, or perhaps more likely to be constructed as problematic if people drink on their own than they drink with other people. And young people is a really good example of this. So there are many countries around the world, France being a very good example of this, where a young person who is not legally allowed to drink on their own, and that might be something which people might construct as problematic, that it's viewed as very socially acceptable and very normal for them to drink a glass of wine with dinner at the table if they're with other people. So all of these things can intersect with one another. Also relevant are personal characteristics. So who you are is a really relevant consideration, he suggests, when people construct drinking as being civilised or uncivilised. With younger people typically being more likely to be designated as uncivilised in their drinking practices, and the working class, he suggests, being more likely to be designated as uncivilised. He also talks about the perceptions around being drunk and the gender differentiations that we can sometimes observe in how women versus men being drunk is often treated. I'm going to talk to you about that in a little more detail in a moment. So Fernell Reid suggests that the rules that exist, obviously these are not explicit government rules or anything, but there's sort of the social and cultural rules, the premises that we all act under, are often different for men and women, with men typically encountering pressures to drink more than women, and still be considered civilised as long as they're able to conceal the effects of what they're consumed. So men are in a very interesting sort of catch-22, we find, in a lot of the language and discourses around alcohol consumption, where on the one hand it is viewed as a marker of masculinity to consume larger amounts of alcohol, and it is much more normalised for men to drink large amounts of alcohol, whereas if women could consume what is perceived to be a large amount of alcohol, they're more likely to be designated uncivilised. At the same time, however, men are expected to be able to drink lots but not show the physical effects of it, to remain in control of themselves and to not appear physically drunk. Otherwise, this sort of has a backwards effect on this notion that being able to drink a lot is a hallmark of masculinity, obviously in quite a pervasive and sort of toxic gender stereotype, but that's not... Just because something is a toxic stereotype does not mean that it doesn't become very prevalent in how it gets discussed and how these concepts are constructed. So he summarises this really nicely, I think. He says, issues of self-control and self-discipline have a long historical provenance in British debates about alcohol and drunkenness. Sensible drinkers might be seen as those who exercise self-control and do not readily abandon themselves to intoxication, with traditional cogitations of masculinity meaning men should be able to hold their drink, interesting metaphor there, by not showing their effects of heavy drinking on the bodily comportment or verbal agility. So essentially he's saying there that women are typically expected to drink less in order to maintain that self-control, and men are both asked to drink more but still maintain that self-control, and that there's a very interesting divide in how the different genders tend to be treated. And obviously we're talking about this in a very sort of essentialist manner, but interesting to reflect in popular media and various texts about whether or not this bears out in practice. In particular, he talks about civilised and uncivilised drinking in terms of relativity, and I think this is a really important concept that we could also apply and think about to any other kind of substance use as well. And I'm just going to read you this quote and then unpick it a little bit for you. So he says, "The self-identification of research participants as sensible drinkers relies on a twofold process of reflection on their own behaviour and relational distancing from that of others." So for those of you who didn't read this article, this is based on a long ethnographic study where he went round and socialised with and followed around groups of people who were members of CAMRA, which is the Real Ale Society, and then a series of interviews that he did with those people as well. And this is what he says. He says, when you talk to these people, they typically construct themselves as sensible drinkers, and they do that in two ways. By reflecting on their own behaviour and finding a way to frame and construct it as being sensible in and of itself, but also in a relational distancing from others. So by constructing some other version of a drinker, either real or imagined, as uncivilised, that compared to that person, my drinking is civilised. My drinking is sensible, and I've constructed an example of what I think is not sensible that I don't fit. And this is how he carries on. He says, "The regularity with which the wayward ways of other drinkers was invoked by interviewees in describing their own drinking as sociable and civilised clearly indicates how sensible drinking is referentially constituted." What he means by that is that we construct our own drinking, if you are somebody who consumes alcohol, that you will tend to construct yourself as a sensible drinker by reference to others or other practices that you consider to be uncivilised, which do not resemble your own. He offers really interesting examples about how everybody does this. So people who are members of the Real Ale Society will say things like, well, I'm a sensible drinker because I don't drink to get drunk. I drink because I enjoy it. I drink because I like it. So yes, I might have 3 or 4 pints, 5 or 6 evenings a week, but because I don't drink to get drunk, and I don't wander around town being really leery or binge drinking, my drinking is therefore sensible. The people who do that are uncivilised and not sensible. And yet at the same time, if you go down onto town on a Friday night and you talk to somebody who's just done 20 Jaeger bombs, they are just as likely to say, well, my drinking's sensible because yes, I binge drink, but I only do it on the weekends. I'm not like those real ale people sat up in the pub drinking 4 or 5 pints every single night. That is uncivilised, and my form of drinking is sensible and civilised. So that it doesn't actually really necessarily matter what the practices and interactions with alcohol consumption are, that most people will tend to construct their own drinking as civilised and find some other version of a drinker that they construct to be uncivilised, and that is what he means by referentially constituted. But he also noticed some quite interesting patterns here. So he said throughout the interviews with the people from the CAMRA Real Ale Society, participants used the hypothetical and implicitly working class binge drinker to act as a foil for their own identifications with a discourse of respectable drinking. And this is interesting to think about in terms of why we feel a need, if you are someone who consumes alcohol, to view your drinking as respectable. Why is it problematic for it to not be respectable? Interesting things to reflect on there. And why might it be that binge drinking and implicitly working class drinkers tend to come in for to cop for this acting as a foil to constitute their drinking as something that's sensible by contrast? So just a couple of reflections to finish this video. To summarise then, how civilised or uncivilised your drinking is depends largely on who you are, and this may often be a relative assessment. So those of you who are watching this video who are teetotal, who don't drink at all, will probably have a very different threshold and a very different set of criteria for what civilised and uncivilised drinking is, compared to those of you who frequently consume alcohol. Where and what a person drinks can also be relevant considerations as to how it is viewed and how it's constructed, and then obviously as linguists we're interested in then how it is discussed. The perceived reasons why a person drinks can also factor into views of how that drinking is characterised. So if there is a perception that somebody is drinking because they like to have fun on a Friday night, that is very different and will often be treated very differently in the discourses surrounding drinking than somebody who other people feel is drinking to self-medicate because they are stressed or because their mental well-being is not brilliant. Interesting things to think about there. A lot of suggestion, I'm going to talk about this more when Dave Peplow does his week on exploring medical interactions, but typically there is also a gendered aspect to this where women are much more likely to be approached and quizzed about whether or not their drinking is healthy and whether they're drinking a healthy amount much sooner than men are. And I think that if we look back to that slide I discussed a moment ago about expectations on men to be able to drink more and to be able to maintain control and not give away physically or verbally that they are drunk, we might see the reasons why that is. So when we look at things like alcohol abuse being much more prevalent in men, are there things that we could point to there as to perhaps some of the reasons why that might be? So men are prototypically expected to be able to drink more without showing signs of having being affected by the alcohol they've consumed. And as such, there is an association between what we might think about as successful heavy drinking and masculinity. Successful obviously depending on how you conceptualise that term. And finally, drinkers will all tend to construct and frame their own drinking as unproblematic and civilised through reference to a real or imagined other. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Just to sort of remind you that we have talked specifically about alcohol here, but I would encourage you to reflect on, in particular, these ideas around relative constructions of alcohol use and these terms civilised and uncivilised that Bernard Reid uses throughout his research as something which could very easily be applied to discourses surrounding any kind of substance. And if you're interested in pursuing a piece for this for your portfolio, I would strongly encourage you to think about that as a fantastic possible idea for a piece of research that you could do. Thank you very much, and I shall see you in the live session.